In a fog-covered town, people had grown used to the sight of an old German shepherd sitting by the abandoned bus stop. Always on time, always watching the steep road that led into the woods. No one knew where he came from, only that each breath he took seemed to carry an untold story. Then one quiet afternoon, a strange girl appeared, green scarf, weathered notebook in hand. And something began to stir between two scarred souls. But why did he suddenly leap into the road? Just to reach a moment that would never be forgotten. The wind swept through the crowns of old oak trees, as if slipping its cold fingers beneath the collars of passing coats. Late winter in Windermere painted a scene of few words. Thin snow clung to red-tiled roofs, and chimney smoke hung like silver threads drifting slowly across a gloomy sky. On the stone steps of wooden porches, faint footprints re-emerged, like echoes of someone who had passed by many times only to retreat into silence before dusk fell. At the northern edge of town stood an old bus stop clinging to the hillside. Its tin roof sagged, the glass walls blurred with dust and frost, and the faded sign had long since lost a few letters. People still called it Windermere Stop Number 3, even though no buses had stopped there in years. Occasionally a high schooler might pedal past in the morning, or an elderly couple would stroll by hand in hand at dusk. But everyone knew that at exactly 5 o'clock each day, a gray silhouette would appear, silent, punctual, and never absent. It was Rocco, an aging German shepherd, with a broad frame and storm-gray fur that hung down both flanks like the remnants of a long-gone thunderstorm. One ear folded slightly, marked with an old tear healed into a pale scar. His eyes were deep and cool, like a winter lake, tinged with yellow when the wind shifted. He didn't run, didn't scan the horizon. He simply sat, always at the same corner beneath the eaves, shielded from the wind. Locals had seen him enough to remember him, yet still chose to cross the road when passing by. Children were warned. If you see the dog at the bus stop, walk around. Don't touch it, don't call it, don't do anything. Parents whispered to one another, heard he bit someone years ago. No one knew if it was true, but like the morning fog, the rumor settled quietly into habit, absorbed into skin and muscle, forming a cautious distance. The mechanic at the top of the hill once said he tried tossing Rocco a bone just to see the dog raise his head and look at him. With eyes so calm and distant, the man instinctively withdrew his hand. There was no growl, no greeting, just a look, quiet and unmoving, as if the dog had seen things no human would dare endure. He never tried again. People called Rocco many names: the silent gatekeeper, the shadow at dusk, or simply the dog waiting for someone who never returned. Because through countless winters, snowstorms, falling leaves, and blooming springs, he kept returning to that spot. Always that corner at that time, staring down the winding dirt path that led into the mountains. The same road people stopped taking after the landslide all those years ago. Rocco braved no rain, yet never failed to arrive. If snow fell, he curled beneath the rusted roof ears, alert eyes half closed, but never truly asleep. When wind howled, his thick fur ruffled faintly, yet he didn't move. And on sunny days, as golden light streamed through cracked glass and pooled on the ground, Rocco sat in the shadow, as if that light had never been meant for him. The old folks in town said Rocco had appeared 4 years ago, right after the landslide on bus Route 33, where driver Carl lost his life. Some remembered a dog that looked exactly like Rocco riding with Carl every day, sitting in the front seat by the window. After the accident, the dog vanished for months, then returned precisely to the bus stop, where Carl once paused each evening for a quiet smoke. No one could confirm the connection, but those who believed in loyalty said, he's still waiting for his person. Waiting by arriving each day at the stop, sitting silently. Waiting by living quietly. Asking for nothing, interacting with no one, never leaving. Waiting in the only way a dog who once loved deeply could possibly understand. And Windmere, in its own way, had learned to let that waiting exist. A grocery store left a water dish near the pine tree by the stop. Though no one officially claimed him, some students snapped pictures from afar, uploading them with captions like, "Windmere's Silent Warrior." But most people kept their distance, because what made them uneasy wasn't teeth or claws, but the feeling that they were standing before a soul, carrying a memory too vast to touch. That evening, Rocco came again. The clouds retreated toward the mountain ridges, and mist stretched low across the slope. His paws pressed gently against the cracked tiles, head tilted slightly, as if listening for a familiar footstep. No one came through the quiet scene. Just the whistle of wind past the stop, the loose sign creaking gently, and Rocco's gaze still fixed on the distance, where the lonely road curled like a brushstroke never finished. Tomorrow, they said, a new family would be moving into the outskirts of town. And no one in Windmere yet knew that a girl named Elira was packing her suitcase, tucking in a worn notebook and a soft green scarf, about to step into a story she couldn't yet imagine. Her mother's moss-green pickup truck stopped in front of a wooden cabin nestled deep in a dirt lane leading toward the forest. Dusk hadn't fully settled, but the pines behind the house already whispered beneath slow-moving fog. Elira sat quietly in the back seat, arms wrapped tightly around an old backpack, the kind with a zipper that rasped each time it closed. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look around. Her mother turned off the engine, smiled softly, and stepped out alone. "Elira, come on, sweetheart." Her mother called, her voice as gentle as wind through an open window. Still, the girl didn't answer. Only after several seconds did Elira climb out her canvas shoes, brushing against the dusty ground. 11 years old, smaller than most kids her age, her long hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck with a silver-gray ribbon. Her knit coat was slightly worn, sleeves frayed at the wrists, but freshly laundered. In her left hand, she clutched a dark wood-colored notebook, its leather edges weathered from countless openings. A small sticker on the cover bore a handwritten message in blue ink. "Things I want to tell, Dad." The new house wasn't large, but it had a fireplace and a porch. When her mother opened the door, the scent of wood and lemon cleanser drifted into the air. The scent of a place about to begin something new. But Elira didn't pay it any mind. She placed her backpack in the corner, sat in the cloth chair by the window, and opened her notebook, like it was the only habit time had never taken away. The first page bore a shaky handwriting, some strokes faint, others bold. The opening line read, "Today, you're no longer here, but I'll still write to you, because I still want to share." The new house was quiet. Too quiet. So much so that even the smallest sounds grew loud. The clink of dishes in the kitchen, the creak of a door hinge, the soft whistle of wind slipping through a crack in the door frame. Within that stillness, Elira bent over the paper and added another line, "We've arrived in Windmere. The sky here is as quiet as the empty room I left behind." She used to live elsewhere, a mountain town where winters stretched long, and her father's voice echoed across the porch every morning. He used to carry her down the steps, counting each one like it was part of a game called the Secret Stairway. Then one year, the snow fell too fast, a trip ended without return, and a newspaper printed the photo of an overturned car at the edge of a ravine. That was when the notebook letters began. Never sent, but always written, filled with everything that hadn't been said in time. Elira didn't know many people. She disliked group games, hated it when others touched her things, and carried her notebook with her wherever she went. Her old teachers used to tell her mother, "She's bright but withdrawn." But her mother never tried to change that. She only held Elira close each night and whispered, "If you want to tell your story, tell it your way." On her first day in Windmere, Elira sat on the porch steps, holding her notebook, head tilted slightly, as if listening for something distant. Her mother mentioned that she'd be introducing her to the new school tomorrow, but Elira only gave a quiet nod. The cold crept into her sleeves, rustling her hair, but her eyes stayed fixed on the fog curling at the foot of the hill. That afternoon, while her mother stepped out to visit the grocery store, Elira decided to take a short walk around the unfamiliar neighborhood. She passed a weathered wooden fence, following a bumpy dirt path where rain from the week before had left shallow puddles. One hand clutched her notebook, the other held onto a faded scarf. She walked slowly, each step a silent question, as if asking whether this new place might allow her to belong. And then she stopped. Up ahead stood an abandoned bus stop, its tin roof dulled to a dusty gray sign swaying slightly in the wind, weeds pushing through cracks in the stone. The stop sat quietly hunched slightly toward the slope like an old soul waiting for a letter that never came. Elira blinked. She couldn't say why, but something about the bus stop felt sad. She stepped forward, nearing the shelter's edge, and paused beneath the overhang. The wind grazed her face, flipping a page of the notebook in her hand. The exposed page read, "Some places are so quiet you can hear what others try to hide." Elira sat on the edge of the stone step, opened the notebook, and began to write. There was no one around. No noise. Just the soft scratch of her pen and the whisper of wind brushing past the glass wall. Behind her, on the damp grass slope, a gray shape stood still. Time near the bus stop seemed to pause. The wind fell silent. Even the grass held its breath. Elira, unaware, kept writing in her slow, careful strokes. Just a few feet behind her, a pair of eyes watched. Not blinking, not shifting, but without threat. Rocco was standing there. That same German shepherd, the gray shadow who had haunted the bus stop for 4 years, stood unmoving forelegs, aligned ears, angled toward the girl. The last light of day slanted across his dark fur, revealing the earth-dusted coat and the folds in his shoulders shaped by time. Elira looked up. Their eyes met. No barking, no alarm. She merely stopped writing, her hand resting on the page, gaze wide for a second, then softening. It was the first time in months she hadn't flinched when something, or someone, unexpected approached. Rocco didn't move. He remained still, as if quietly assessing whether the small being before him posed any danger. Elira said nothing. She didn't back away. Instead, she did what she often did. At the end of the day, she flipped back to an older entry and began to read. Not for an audience, not out loud for anyone in particular, but simply so the words could find their way out. October 19th, her voice was a whisper, barely more than breath in the wind. The snow came late today. Mom says maybe this winter won't be as harsh. But I feel colder than other years. Do you know what I mean, Dad? Some colds don't touch the skin. They stay inside. Like when I miss you in the afternoons. Rocco tilted his head. One ear twitched as if he had caught an unfamiliar sound. Elira paused. She turned to another page, not glancing at the dog, not displaying fear. The wind tugged at her scarf, drawing it across her shoulder. Rocco's eyes followed the fabric, the faded sea blue. And for a brief instant, something in his expression gave way. This page was from when I learned to press a fountain pen nib without snapping it, she read, voice steady. I told you about it, even though you weren't home anymore. I kept telling you, because you once said, as long as there are stories, things will keep moving. She read for 10 minutes. No rush, no sorrow. Her tone was calm, like she was rewriting her father's voice in sound soft and even, filling the quiet space around her. Rocco kept watching. He didn't approach, but he didn't leave. On any other day, the slightest intrusion would have driven him off. He was a wind-shy presence, a retreating echo. But today felt different. This girl hadn't pushed into his world. She had simply settled beside it, allowing both their silences to exist without demand or explanation. The golden light faded into gray. Shadows crept up the stone and cast the stop into cool twilight. Elira gently closed her notebook, tucking it into her coat. As she rose, she didn't turn away. She stepped sideways, sparing a glance at the dog. Rocco was still there, but now his head tilted slightly, gaze softened just enough to resemble something less guarded. The girl walked slowly, her scarf trailing gently behind her. There were no hurried steps, no guarded glances, only the quiet between two souls, both once fractured, who had brushed against each other through a language no one else could truly understand. That day, Rocco left the bus stop later than usual. He stayed a few minutes longer, his gaze following the small figure as she disappeared down the dirt road. For the first time in years, he didn't rise the moment the sun kissed the horizon. On the other side of town, Elira's mother had just finished washing her hands when she saw her daughter walk through the door. The girl removed her coat carefully, hung it on the rack, and opened her notebook to write. She said nothing, showed no sign of surprise or change. But when her mother approached, she caught a freshly written line. "I met someone today. They didn't speak, but I still understood." The next morning, fog slipped through the trees like a soft scarf winding around the town's narrow streets. The sun remained hidden behind the mountain ridge, leaving Windmere wrapped in a damp, familiar gloom. Elira had awakened early. She sat at the edge of her bed, notebook still resting beside her pillow from the night before. No alarm, no schedule, just a quiet pull to go out a little earlier than usual. She wrapped her old scarf twice around her neck and secured it at the front. Downstairs, her mother was making breakfast, the gentle clang of pans rising through the floorboards. Elira came down, gave a small wave in greeting, then silently stepped outside, clutching the notebook close to her chest. When she neared the bus stop, the gray shadow was already there. Rocco sat beneath the shelter, just like the day before, just like countless evenings Elira had never seen until now. His posture was solid as stone, gaze fixed on the road winding into the hills. The breeze stirred the fur around his neck, but the rest of him remained still, as if time itself had no claim over him. Elira paused a few feet away, saying nothing. She understood now silence wasn't rejection. Sometimes silence was the only way two broken things could sit beside each other and feel whole. She stepped closer, just enough to sit on a stone step one level below where Rocco rested. Not too near. She didn't look directly at him. Instead, she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to read. Her voice was neither loud nor soft, just enough to echo gently beneath the tin roof amid the scratched glass and moss-streaked brick. "Today is colder," she read aloud, "but I don't feel it. Maybe because I'm telling a story I thought only I could hear." Rocco didn't turn his head. But if one looked closely, his ears had tilted ever so slightly, tuned to a rhythm carried by air just beyond understanding. Elira looked up at the sky and said in a softer voice, still reading from her own words, "I'm not sure if I'm talking to Dad or to someone who feels a bit like him. But I think I'm not alone anymore." When she finished, she closed the notebook and rested it on her lap. Her fingers gently brushed the worn leather along its edges. And for the first time that morning, she turned to Rocco, not to speak, not to expect anything, but simply to look. It was a gaze of quiet respect, as if she were in the presence of something sacred. Rocco didn't react. He continued staring toward the distant path, his expression carved from frost, serious still. And yet within that stillness, something had shifted. He hadn't left. That alone was change. For him, staying in place while someone else drew near had once been unthinkable. But today, Elira had sat this close, And he had remained. Elira lowered her head and tucked the notebook carefully back into her coat. She didn't stand immediately. She simply sat a little longer, letting the silent presence beside her settle like warmth beneath the skin. She didn't try to pet him, didn't call his name, didn't try to earn his attention. Just being near. That was enough. When the first light broke through the clouds and spilled across the broken tiles, Elira rose slowly. She brushed off her coat, adjusted her scarf, and stepped backward out from under the roof. Her foot crunched gently on dry pine needles. She didn't turn away right away. She looked back. And for the first time, Rocco's gaze wasn't fixed on the old mountain road. He was watching her. A look that wasn't harsh nor guarded. Just following her as one might follow someone who had once been lost and now in some quiet way had begun to find their way back. In the pale light of late winter between two souls bearing different cracks, something had shifted, softly without warning, but clearly enough to still the wind and pause time for a single breath. Elira walked slower than she had the day before. At the end of the path, she turned once more. Rocco was still sitting there, his strong frame silhouetted inside the bus stop, bathed in fading light. He wasn't guarding. He wasn't claiming territory. It was as if he were keeping watch over a place that had once marked the end of waiting, and might become the beginning of something else. That night in her notebook, Elira wrote, "I don't know why I didn't feel afraid today. Maybe because a pair of eyes held me there. Not with words like stay, but in the way Dad once did. The day I climbed the rooftop, and he didn't shout, didn't pull me down. He just stood below watching, waiting for me to come down on my own. No pressure, no force, just waiting." The next morning, Elira woke earlier than ever. She sat quietly on her bed knees, hugged close eyes, fixed on the folded scarf on her desk. The only thing left that still carried her father's scent. It was a handmade scarf, sea blue faded to gray with a few loose threads at the corners. Her father used to wear it every winter morning, then kneel and wrap it gently around Elira's neck with rough hands that moved as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever held. She picked up the scarf and pressed it to her chest. Today, she would bring it with her. The kitchen downstairs was already warm. Her mother was preparing breakfast, some hot soup and toasted bread. The soft scent of butter mingled with the clink of chopsticks tapping the edge of a pot. Elira didn't speak. She just sat nodding as her mother offered a smile. On her plate were 2 slices of toast, one large one smaller. "You can take half with you," her mother said, "in case you feel like eating outside." Elira nodded, then quietly slipped the smaller slice of toast into her coat pocket, along with her folded scarf and the worn notebook. The sky was clouded over that morning, a pale gray light casting soft shadows across the rooftops. Wind swept through the wooden fence, sending a handful of dry leaves swirling like dancers rehearsing a long-forgotten waltz. When she arrived at the bus stop, Rocco was already there. Same place, same posture. The gray shadow sat in silence beneath the shelter, his eyes still as a winter lake gazing into the distance, not with longing, not in wait, but simply being. Elira walked forward slowly. This time she didn't stop as far away as before. She sat a little closer, close enough to feel the faint warmth he gave off into the chilly morning air, but still far enough that Rocco wouldn't feel his space had been intruded upon. From her pocket, she pulled out the slice of toast wrapped in thin wax paper. She didn't hold it out. She just gently placed it on the tile floor between them, about 2 handspans apart. Then Elira opened her notebook and read a short entry. "November 24th, she began softly. "That was the day I sat in the hospital room while Mom told me about the avalanche. She said everything collapsed so fast. Just one loud boom, and then it was all gone. She paused, eyelids lowering slightly. Dad was driving cargo up the mountain that day. Mom said he never had a chance to turn back. I can't picture it. But I know. If he had turned around, he would have stopped the truck, stepped out, and told everyone, "Hop in, I'll take you home." Because that's the kind of person he was. A soft breeze slipped through the cracks of the shelter. Each word Elira spoke seemed to linger, then dissolve gently into the aged stone beneath them. Rocco still didn't move, but his eyes no longer focused on the mountain pass. For a fleeting second, he glanced toward the girl. Brief, then returned his gaze. Elira quietly placed her notebook down, then slowly pulled the scarf from her pocket. She didn't wear it. She smoothed out the folded corners, squatted down, and gently laid it next to the piece of toast. Between the two was only half a step, close enough for the dog to smell if he wished. She whispered barely loud enough for herself to hear Dad used to wear this every morning. It still holds his scent, more than any photo ever could. I never let anyone else touch it, not even Mom. But today, I think maybe, just maybe, someone else might understand what I still can't say out loud. Rocco blinked. A tiny movement, but unmistakable. Then the old dog slowly lowered his head. His eyes remained open, but his nose edged forward, toward the scarf. A soft breath passed across the edge of the fabric. Elira stayed completely still, not expecting anything, not hoping. Yet something inside her chest cracked just slightly. Not in pain, but in relief, like pressure finally released after being held too long. Rocco sniffed once, then drew his head back. He didn't eat the bread. He didn't touch the scarf. But he had acknowledged it. He had accepted the presence of something that carried the scent of someone she loved most in the world. For Elira, that was enough. She sat quietly for a few more minutes, then rose to her feet. She didn't take the scarf with her. She left it there, beside the toast, like a silent offering to the soul who kept vigil at the station of memories. As she stepped out from beneath the roof, Elira didn't look back immediately. She walked several paces, then stopped, turning around slowly. Rocco hadn't moved from his spot. But this time his eyes weren't fixed on the distant road. They were settled on the space where the scarf now lay. That night, Elira wrote in her notebook, "I gave away something I treasured most. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to lose it. Because I think that dog understood." The next morning she returned, knees pulled up beneath her coat, notebook in hand, the pages worn and curling slightly at the edges. The scarf still lay where she had left it. The toast was gone, maybe eaten, maybe taken by the earth. But to Elira, what remained mattered more than what had vanished. Rocco was there too, just a few steps away. He no longer faced the mountain road. Today he sat angled slightly, just enough to keep Elira in view without facing her directly. It was the first time the space between them had truly shifted, not through movement, but through quiet permission. Elira began to read again, her voice steady and even, as if reciting not just memories, but pieces of herself she had once tucked away. December 13th. I woke up in the new house. There's a small crack in the ceiling. I counted 8 tiles from the bed to the window. Mom says we'll be okay. But I'm not sure. Some nights I dream I'm screaming, and no one hears me. The wind passed through the pine trees behind the stop, rustling with a slow, breath-like sigh, like the forest itself was listening. Elira paused, gently smoothing the page, then continued. This time slower. I didn't tell Mom I was scared. Not because she wouldn't care, but because some fears have no words. They just sit there like shadows in the corner of a room, not doing anything but always there. She glanced down at the tiles beneath her feet. where black cracks ran like veins across the stone, thin as the lines on her palm. I'm afraid this house won't hold dreams. I'm afraid that when I tell bedtime stories, no one will be at the edge of the bed nodding the way Dad used to. I'm afraid that if I stay quiet too long, I'll forget what my own voice sounds like. No one answered, but Rocco shifted slightly. A movement so small, his front paw turning his body inching just half a hand's width closer. Yet to Elira, it was more than enough. She didn't look up. She pretended to keep reading, kept her voice even, because something told her that if she startled the moment it might disappear. I used to whisper into my pillow, just to hear myself. But pillows don't nod, walls don't reply. And silence always wins. Rocco gave a faint shiver, a rustle of his thick fur sending a soft whisper through the morning air. Elira glanced sideways from the corner of her eye. He was closer now, just a small step away. He didn't look at her, but his breath warmed the space between them. She didn't turn around. She simply lowered her voice softer now. Yesterday I left the scarf. Today I still didn't take it back. Dad once told me, if you trust someone, leave something precious behind. If it's still there when you return, that person is worth keeping in your life. For a moment the wind held its breath. Just a few seconds of stillness, enough to make every other sound dissolve. Elira could hear the soft turn of a page and the faint rhythmic beat of her own heart. She wrote one more line. I'm learning how not to scream, just to speak softly, hoping someone is listening. Then she closed the notebook, resting it on her lap. And for the first time since arriving in Windermere, she turned, fully without hesitation, and looked at Rocco for a long while. The dog looked back. That gaze, deep, still dusted with time, held no threat, no retreat, just a steady, silent acknowledgement. Something between them had been understood, though no words were exchanged. Elira smiled, not wide but true. There was no wag of a tail, no overt gesture of welcome. But the distance between them had shifted. Erased not by footsteps, but by an unwavering gaze, a steady breath, and the release of a quiet presence that no longer braced itself like armor. That evening, under the warm glow of her desk lamp, Elira opened her notebook and wrote faster than usual. Her handwriting was firmer, her lines clearer. At the bottom of the page she wrote, "Tonight I didn't whisper into my pillow. I told a story, and I think someone was listening. No reply needed. Just someone who stayed." Windermere was a quiet town. Wooden houses scattered along the sloped, narrow roads, blanketed in pine shadows, old lampposts that still flickered each night, whether anyone passed beneath them or not. The wind didn't howl here. It slipped between fences like an old habit. People too moved with habit memory and the cautious reverence reserved for things no one dared ask about. No one remembered exactly when Rocco first appeared. Some said it was after an accident. Others claimed he once belonged to a soldier from the northern hills. But ever since the bus stop was removed from the main route, that dog had taken his place beneath the shelter. Every evening, every morning, whenever the clouds stooped low. And now, for the past few weeks, a second figure had begun to appear beside the familiar gray shadow. A little girl with a faded green scarf and a notebook held tight against her chest. People didn't ask. They just looked. From bicycles from behind bus windows heading toward the old mill. Two silhouettes, one young one weathered, one who wrote, one who sat silent, became a quiet ritual that gave Windermere a story no one quite knew how to begin telling. That morning, Elira arrived earlier than usual. She wore a thicker coat and carried a new notebook since the old one was nearly full. The winter wind slipped through her sleeves and collar, but she didn't flinch. Under the shelter, Rocco was already seated, his posture straight, ears turned toward the sound of familiar footsteps. They sat like that, without touching, without needing a greeting. Elira opened her notebook and began to read what she had written the night before. Once I dropped my pen in class. Everyone laughed. I quietly picked it up. In that moment, I wished someone had been beside me. Not to help me up, just not to laugh. She paused, glancing at the dog beside her. Rocco didn't move, but his eyes had softened again, just slightly more each day. Elira placed the notebook on her lap, then said quietly, "Not to anyone in particular, I think maybe. I've found that someone now." At that very moment, from the bend in the road just a few yards away, a familiar figure in town came to a slow stop. It was Mr. Harmon, the retired mechanic, wearing his old oatmeal-colored knit cap, walking his usual morning route to the shop just to see if the oil still smells like it used to. He wasn't known for conversation. No one had seen him speak to anyone much since his wife passed away. But today, he stood looking toward the bus stop, eyes narrowed behind thick lenses. Then, without hurry, he pulled a tin can of dog food from his coat pocket. An old brand, the kind only longtime dog owners still remembered how to choose. He set it down by the base of a nearby lamppost a few paces from the bus stop. No words, no signals. Then he turned and walked away, hands in pockets, his shape disappearing into the mist as if he'd never stopped. Elira saw him. She didn't call out. She didn't pick up the can. She simply turned to look at Rocco. The dog hadn't moved, but his eyes had shifted, focused now on the can, not with suspicion, but as if he understood it wasn't charity. It was something quieter, a gesture, a kind of acceptance offered silently. That afternoon, when Elira left for home, she carried nothing extra, just the new notebook already half filled. The can remained where it was. She gave Rocco a small nod, as she always did now, a quiet ritual between them. Before leaving, she looked around once more, then scribbled one last line. "Someone saw us." And they didn't turn away. That night at a diner near the gas station, people began to speak softly about the strange girl with the old scarf and the silent dog at the bus stop. Not in gossip, but in slow, thoughtful sentences, like they were touching on something tender they hadn't yet found the words to name. One person said, "I saw her reading something." And the dog just sat like he understood every word. Another added, "She probably doesn't talk much. But when you see her, you feel like being quiet, too." And so, in that hush, the story of a girl who didn't say much and a dog who didn't bark began to take root in Windmere's misty afternoons. Whenever the wind rolled down from the ridge and swept through the bus stop, Rocco would often lift his head, ears tilting towards something distant, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. The wind carried the scent of melting snow, of ancient pines, and of old memories, no longer present, but never truly gone. Elira didn't know Rocco's past. But each time she read about her father, each time she sat quietly beneath that wind-swept roof, she had a strange feeling that somewhere deep inside Rocco's silent chest, there was also someone he once called by a name, one that didn't need to be spoken out loud. And then on a gray, mist-veiled afternoon, when the sun seemed to have forgotten how to rise, the story began to surface, not through words, but through slow-moving images in Rocco's memory, long buried under layers of time and dust. Years ago, along the same winding mountain road that wrapped around the town of Windmere, there used to be a small bus that ran each day, carrying workers, elderly locals, school children, and sometimes travelers chasing snowflakes. Behind the wheel was Carl, a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, a heavy coat that smelled faintly of tobacco, and a habit of keeping an unlit cigarette tucked behind his ear, like a ritual he never gave up. Rocco had once been his companion. No leash, no name tag, no formal training, Just a drenched dog standing outside the station one rainy morning, staring into the empty bus with hollow, pleading eyes. Carl had pulled over, opened the door, and let him hop into the back seat without a word. From that day on, Rocco never missed a ride. Each morning, as the bus engine growled awake, Rocco would leap into the seat beside the window. Ears turned toward the sound of tires skimming over packed snow. Carl would drive in silence, left hand steady on the wheel, right resting near an old silver lighter. They never talked. But in the evenings, when the passengers had all disembarked, Carl would pull out half a dry loaf of bread, tear it in two. One piece for himself, dipped into lukewarm coffee, the other for Rocco. Once the bus stalled mid-pass due to heavy snowfall. Carl lit his last cigarette of the day, fingers trembling slightly, eyes locked on the white haze ahead. Rocco stood beside him, not barking, not whimpering, just resting his head gently against Carl's thick trouser leg, as if to say, "I'm still here." Carl reached down, scratched the dog's head, and chuckled softly. "We're two quiet souls," he murmured. "But even silence needs someone to share it with." That winter was harsher than most. One morning, with a blizzard threatening to close the roads, Carl still chose to drive. The mountain route needed to bring a few workers home before the pass became impassable. Rocco took his usual seat, but when the bus turned onto the final bend near the northern ridge, where the snow had begun to loosen, the unthinkable happened. A faint rumble. The ground shifted. Pines along the slope quivered like they were bowing to something vast and unseen. They said the bus disappeared in seconds. No full wreckage was found, just part of a wheel and a long skid mark that vanished into the chasm below. But 2 days later, Rocco was spotted, soaked blood seeping down his back legs, standing in front of the old bus stop at the foot of the pass. He didn't bark, he didn't run. He just stood, eyes fixed on the snow-covered road, just like he did now whenever Elira read the final lines of the day. Elira didn't know why Rocco leaned into the scarf that day. She had simply been reading about the afternoon her father had taken her to the wind-blown hilltop one last time. The day he walked beside her bike, then stopped mid-path and said, "See that? Where the wind blows strongest, there's always a road waiting to be found." Rocco, still silent, took a step forward and tilted his head toward the faded green scarf resting beside her notebook. For the first time, he lowered his muzzle and let it rest against the edge of the scarf, holding it there longer than usual. And in that moment, Elira didn't keep reading. She didn't speak. She just sat still. Because something told her that somewhere in the buried corners of Rocco's memory, where bread was torn in half and engine rumble mingled with the scent of tobacco, there lingered the echo of a man who had also once left behind a scarf, a road, and a dog waiting at the edge of the world. That evening, Elira wrote, "I used to think Dad was the only one who understood what I never said aloud. But now I know. There was someone else who once sat like me, beside a soul who never spoke yet somehow heard everything." That day had begun like any other. Wind swept down from the mountain slope, carrying a chill that crept past even the thickest coats. Snow had fallen for 3 nights straight, layering rooftops, sidewalks, and the drooping pine branches in a soft, growing weight. The people of Windmere were used to enduring winter. But that year, the cold didn't just sting harder. It pressed down heavier. Carl's old bus still rumbled along its route tires, crunching over compacted snow, its rhythm steady like the heartbeat of the town. On board were a few workers and an elderly woman who'd boarded from the gas station. Carl lit a cigarette but didn't smoke it, just held it in the corner of his mouth, a familiar comfort. His hands gripped the wheel with quiet focus. Rocco sat beside him in the passenger seat, his body tense, like a taut string between 2 gusts of wind. As they approached the northern ridge, a stretch of narrow mud with a steep cliff on one side. Carl eased the bus into a slower crawl, eyes squinting at the thickening flurries ahead. The sky looked strange. Then the wind shifted, and with it came a thunderous crack, like the bones of the forest had snapped in two. Carl barely managed a muttered breath. Damn it. Above them, a massive sheet of snow broke loose, mixed with soil roots, shattered branches. It crashed down like a white tidal wave, tearing through the trees, swallowing everything in its path. Carl slammed the brakes, wrenched the wheel, but the tires couldn't hold. The bus skidded fishtailed. Screams, glass rattling. Rocco shot up, body rigid, eyes locked to the right, toward the avalanche, rushing like a living curtain. And then in the chaos, Carl reached across, yanked the passenger door open, and shoved Rocco out with one swift push. The dog tumbled through deep snow, body flipping, slamming into icy drifts until finally landing in a thicket just outside the slide's reach. A moment later, a deafening boom, and the road ahead vanished. The bus, the passengers, Carl, swallowed whole in a blinding sea of white. Hours later, rescuers uncovered a crushed section of the bus, buried beneath 3 meters of snow. No one had survived. But what the people of Windmere remembered most was this: Rocco had not left the edge of the cliff. He had lain there, trembling back leg bleeding, staring into the void where the road once had been. For the next 3 days, no one saw him again. They assumed he had died. That winter stretched longer than usual. When the sun returned and melted the surface, the mountains revealed snapped tree trunks, shattered timbers from the bus frame, red plastic seats scattered like bones. But of Rocco, there was no sign. A week passed, then 2, then a month, then 3. During those long months, people whispered about sightings of a gray dog drifting through the woods, wild, gaunt, with eyes that looked like a soul too stubborn to leave this world behind. Some said they saw it gnawing on stones out of hunger. Others claimed they heard a long, mournful howl deep in the night, stretching across the mountains like a cry lost in the folds of time. Eventually, the town accepted that the dog was gone, either far away or gone for good. But one early spring morning, when the snow had just melted into patchy puddles along the footpaths, a little girl walking hand in hand with her mother passed by the old bus stop. Suddenly, she tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, "someone's waiting." Her mother turned. Beneath the broken roof tile of the forgotten shelter, a shadow-gray dog sat still. His head was lowered, eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. Scars marked his back, one leg dragged slightly, and his fur clumped from nights without shelter. But his gaze, deep and quiet, remained untouched, like a promise that had never been fulfilled. From that day on, Rocco never left the stop. Whether rain or shine, whether passers-by cast him wary glances or curious stares, he remained exactly there, as if waiting for the old bus to reappear from the vanished snowpath and for Carl in his thick coat to step out, knock on the hood, and say, "Time to go home, buddy." That day, Elira sat beside him and read from a fresh page in her notebook. "There's something I once thought no one could understand, the feeling of being left behind. But now I see. Maybe I'm not the only one waiting." She looked over at Rocco. He still faced the horizon, but this time, he tilted his head slightly toward her, as if to say that in a world where lost things aren't spoken of, there are still souls willing to pause their own search just to sit beside someone else. The road to the abandoned bus stop was little more than a side path hidden behind a line of aging maple trees. In winter, snow usually buried parts of it, making it easy to forget, unless someone needed shelter from the rain or a place to rest. The wooden overhang had turned a silvery gray, the support beams flaking paint, and the Windmere transit sign hung crooked in the wind. No one said it out loud, but everyone in town knew this was Carl's old spot. Each evening when the last bus came back into town, Carl used to park just beside the stop, lean against the post light, the cigarette he'd been saving since morning, and split the remaining half of his sandwich with the dog at his feet. Rocco always lay at the edge of the shelter, eyes half closed, ears alert to the end-of-day soundtrack. Children's hurried footsteps, bike bells, and the wind threading its way between rooftops. After the landslide, Rocco disappeared. People assumed he'd gone with Carl, or hadn't survived the wounds no one had seen. So when the wind finally stilled and the sun peeked through thinning clouds to touch the edges of town, Rocco's reappearance at the bus stop felt like a gentle knock on the town's collective memory. Mr. Harmon, the retired mechanic who lived nearby, was the first to notice. It wasn't anyone else, he later recounted. Voice rasped with time. It was him, right there beside the post. Same place his shadow used to fall all those years ago. Rocco didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply lay there, tucking his injured leg beneath him, head slightly bowed, eyes locked on the vacant road. His gaze didn't plead, and it didn't despair. It just watched, as though the only thing that still mattered was to remain where something real had once existed. From that day forward, Rocco didn't leave the stop. People passing by would glance over. Some whispered, "That's him, Carl's dog." Others crossed to the opposite side of the street, not from fear, but because Rocco's silence made them hesitate to break it. He didn't let anyone come too close. If someone tried, even gently, Rocco would lift his head. No growl, no sudden move, just a gaze, so deep, so still, that it made people stop and step back without realizing why. And so the space between him and the world held steady, not because of fences, but because of something wordless in his eyes. Once a woman named Karen, the baker at the end of the street, brought a sandwich, placed it several feet away, and quietly stepped back. Rocco didn't move until she had disappeared from sight. Then he slowly approached, sniffed it, and left it untouched. He didn't eat it, but he didn't destroy it either. Everything remained, exactly where it was, exactly when it was, as if every act was part of a sacred ritual. A few days later, Elira arrived at the stop with her notebook nearly full. She sat at the edge of the shelter, just far enough not to crowd him, just close enough that their silence could breathe freely between them. She didn't read right away. She just sat, like Carl once did after long routes through snow. Inside the notebook, a line had already been written, I think. If a soul chooses to stay in one place, all those days, all those months, then something there must have held its heart tightly enough to keep it from leaving. Rocco looked up at her. Elira didn't look back. She simply rested her hand on the ground between them, where the afternoon light spilled through the broken roof in a warm golden streak. From that day on, every evening Elira returned as the sun dipped low, and every evening Rocco was already there, never moving, never allowing anyone else near, except her. The townspeople grew used to the sight, a quiet girl with a notebook and a silent dog, like two shadows layered atop one another, one young, one old, both carrying something lost, neither quite ready to let go. That night, Elira wrote one more passage. Maybe the reason a soul returns to where it once hurt is because that place also held a love deep enough to leave footprints. And if they stay, someone else, like me, might come, not to fix it, just to sit beside it. That evening, the wind stilled more than usual. Sunlight poured through the branches of maple trees, casting warm, tea-colored light across the narrow road that led to the bus stop. Elira arrived as always, not late, not early, clutching her notebook scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, the edges frayed with age. She sat on the wooden step a single arm's length away from Rocco, their familiar distance now as natural as breath, as steady as the presence they shared in quiet. Rocco lay still, but there was something different in his dark eyes. They no longer searched the horizon or the snow-blanketed ridgeline. Today they flicked toward Elira every now and then, not out of reflex, but as if searching for something. The wind drifted through again, carrying the scent of pine-damp grass and something achingly familiar. Rocco lifted his head. His nose twitched, slightly, ears angling fully toward Elira. She wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on a page blurred by rain from a few days ago, her pinky finger tracing slow circles on the paper's edge. The dog extended his neck. His gaze slid past her shoulder and came to rest on the scarf hanging loosely around her chest. The scent wasn't sharp, just faint enough to stir a fragment from beneath the snow-drowned edges of memory. Damp fabric after a long ride, cold coffee spilled on a jacket sleeve, the lingering smoke of a half-burnt log, and the scent of a man who used to lean down gently, touch his head, and say, "Come here, boy." Elira turned and saw that Rocco was looking at her. His expression wasn't guarded. It wasn't cautious. There was something softer in his eyes, as if for the first time he saw her as more than the quiet girl who wrote and read, as if she was something deeper than language. She placed the notebook down without speaking. Her hand gently touched the scarf. Her voice was quiet, closer to breath than speech. "My dad used to wear this when he went up the mountain." Rocco kept watching. "I've never washed it, not because it's dirty, but because I'm scared if I do that smell will disappear with the soap." The dog slowly crept forward. Not fast, not desperate, just one half step closer, until his body was nearly level with the step where she sat. Then he leaned forward, and for the first time let his nose touch the edge of the scarf. Elira froze. Her breath paused. Her hand tightened around the notebook. She didn't move, afraid that even the smallest shift might dissolve the moment like morning mist. Rocco inhaled long and deep. Then, without warning, he gently touched his head to Elira's hand. A contact with no force, no fear, no expectation. Just a soft acknowledgement. This scent. I've known it before, and now I remember. Elira looked down. Her gaze, so often cast low, lifted and met the deep brown of his eyes. There was no tension in that look, no barrier. Just the shared presence of two beings once torn from the world, now quietly, completely seen. She smiled. Not brightly, not widely, but it was the first real smile to rise from the hidden chambers of her memory. Slowly she placed her other hand on Rocco's head. Her tiny fingers met his thick, weathered fur that bore scars and time. She didn't stroke him. She simply rested her hand there, as if to say, "I'm here." From a distance, someone walking by glimpsed a scene no one in Windmere had ever seen before. The old dog who let no one near was now letting a child rest her hand on his head. And both remained still, as if any sound would be too loud for a moment so sacred. That night, Elira wrote, "Some things we thought were lost in the wind come back when the scent returns. And when it does, the heart recognizes it and dares to believe that maybe the one we loved never really left. Maybe they've just sent their breath forward, waiting for someone patient enough to sit and listen." She closed the notebook and set it gently on her desk. Then she looked up at the ceiling, where night settled like dust on old beams. Elira touched the scarf again. The scent was still there. But now it wasn't just her father's. It had become a bridge between what was lost and a soul learning to trust the present. The next morning, the sky was startlingly clear. Thin clouds drifted over the wooden rooftops, and the breeze was soft, barely strong enough to stir the pine branches on the hill. The snow had mostly melted, exposing damp earth tire tracks and twisted roots that had slept beneath winter's weight. There were no sirens, No noise to signal something had shifted. Just one quiet difference: Elira didn't come. The old bus stop stood still in its corner of the road. Its wooden roof tilted southward as usual. A small sparrow perched on the rusted signboard, then flew off. But beneath the shelter, Rocco had arrived early. He sat in his usual spot, beside the post where Carl used to lean near the small crack between planks, where Elira always sat cross-legged with her notebook. But today, there were no pages rustling, no scent of fresh ink, no green scarf fluttering in the breeze. At first, Rocco simply lay still. His eyes searched the road, the bend where she always appeared. Notebook hugged close, scarf draped across her collar. Rain or shine, she always arrived on time, sitting gently like someone returning to the place where part of their heart still lingered. But today time passed, and she didn't come. An hour, then 2. The wind shifted. Dusk began to stretch across the town. Rocco remained. His ears flicked with each far-off sound: footsteps, tires on gravel, the creak of the bus sign in the wind. Each one made him shift slightly, then stillness again, as if hope rose, and then faded, over and over. Not exhausted, but unsettled. As the sun disappeared, a long breath escaped the old dog's chest, a sound like weariness finally given form. That night, under the roof of house number 11 on Kingsley Street, Elira's mother sat beside a hospital bed. The girl had developed a high fever the night before, likely from staying out in an unexpected chill. The sterile room was all white, the blanket thick, yet unable to hide the pale shade around her lips. The doctor called it a severe cold, weak immune system worn down from weeks of winter air. Elira was barely conscious, murmuring faintly in a fevered dream. "I left the notebook at the stop. I need to go back. Rocco's waiting." Her mother gently wiped the sweat from her daughter's brow. And in that moment, she finally understood the old bus stop wasn't just a quiet place her child visited. It was where her daughter had offered up memory after memory, where she whispered what she couldn't tell anyone else. To a creature who might not speak, might not reply, but had become her most faithful keeper of silence. And at that very moment, Rocco was still there. No rain, no snow, no storms. But under the dim street lamp, passers-by caught a glimpse the old dog lifting his head, exhaling slowly, stepping forward, then circling back, returning to his place once again. A woman named May, who sold dried flowers at the corner of the market, saw everything from a distance. She quietly reached into the pocket of her cardigan, pulled out a stale biscuit, and bit into it with a faint smile. "Guess he's worried?" she murmured, eyes never leaving the bus stop. That night, Windermere sank into silence. In the dim hospital room, Elira stirred around midnight, whispering Rocco's name in her sleep. She turned her head toward the fogged-up window, then sighed. Not from pain, but from the quiet ache of wondering whether someone out there thought she had left without saying goodbye. The next morning, as her mother poured tea in the tiny hospital kitchen, Elira croaked out in a hoarse voice, "Mom, can you bring me the green scarf? It still smells like Dad, and Rocco might miss it." Her mother paused, surprised, but then nodded gently. She didn't ask questions. Sometimes it's enough for a grown-up to know that a child has a reason to miss someone. That even an old weather-beaten bus stop can become a sacred home for a heart that's been searching too long. Outside the bus stop remained the same. Rocco, patient, silent, was still there. He didn't know time. He expected no reward. He waited because something was missing, a familiar voice that used to read softly beside him, coloring the afternoons with words that never asked for anything but presence. After the day, Elira didn't show up. Something quietly shifted in the heart of the town. No one made announcements. No one went door to door or printed flyers that read, "The dog at the bus stop needs help." But early the next morning, a small paper bag appeared beside the wooden post where Rocco usually lay. Tied carefully with twine, it held 2 ham sandwiches still wrapped in the brown deli paper from May's shop. Rocco didn't touch it immediately. As always, he waited until the footsteps faded before he leaned forward to sniff. No rush, no desperation. Just a quiet test, as if the world was offering a fragile gesture and he was deciding whether to accept it. The day after that, a small bowl of clean water appeared. Next to it, a crumpled scrap of paper written in messy handwriting. "My name is Liam. I'm 6. I'm sorry I threw snowballs at you. I thought you didn't like kids, but Elira really likes you. I hope you forgive me." There was no signature, but the awkward scrawl left an imprint on every eye that paused to read it. People who once looked away now walked slower past the stop. Those who had once called him the Stray began to call him by name, softly as if learning to say it without startling the air. That afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the damp grass, a tousle-haired boy ran past Jill's general store, carrying a small wooden board. He climbed a bench, taped something to the glass window with clear tape, then sprinted off without a word. Later that evening, Mr. Jill, the shopkeeper, locked up and noticed what the boy had left. It was a watercolor painting, rough but deeply felt. A small girl sat at the edge of the bus stop. Beside her, a large ash-gray dog. Both faced forward toward a road stretched beneath a sky with a faint rainbow arching across it. Below the picture, the boy had signed Elira's little brother. "I drew this so people won't forget there's someone, and a dog, waiting for something more beautiful." The painting stirred the town. Within days, people stopped by the store not just for milk or bread, but to gaze at the picture. Some stared silently. Others smiled faintly, then wiped their eyes as if dust had snuck in. A librarian, after seeing it, brought a children's book to the bus stop and laid it gently beside where Rocco usually rested. The cover showed a rescue dog and a girl with short hair. The book was damp with dew by the next morning. But long before the rain fell, Rocco had already touched it with his nose and lingered there for a long, silent moment. At the hospital, Elira began to recover. Though she still coughed and tired easily, after speaking, her eyes had a new brightness. One morning, a nurse entered the room and found her staring at a phone screen. Not a game, but a photo of the watercolor taped to Mr. Jill's window. Someone had sent it to her mother, who then shared it with her. Elira stared for a long time, unmoving. Her fingertip traced the painted green scarf sliding slowly over the paper's texture. Then she smiled. He's not alone anymore. Rocco still returned to the bus stop every day. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't surrounded by fear or suspicion. The quiet gifts, the glances that didn't avert the whispered thank yous. Each one wove a soft, invisible blanket around a dog who had once lost both his person and his place in the world. And in the final moments of sunlight that brushed across his back, someone walking past might notice Rocco's ears were angled slightly. Not with tension, but as though listening for something gentle. That night, Elira wrote in her notebook, "Maybe a living soul doesn't need to be fully understood, just not feared. And when a heart becomes gentle enough to stay, the world starts inching closer, like how he slowly let others touch the grief he carried, with respect and with love." The next morning, the breeze carried the scent of fresh earth after a midnight rain. The sun hadn't warmed enough to dry the damp wooden step of the bus stop, but it brought just enough light to keep the gloom away. The maple tree at the street corner had begun to sprout tender green buds, a quiet signal that winter was finally letting go. Rocco arrived early. He lay on the cold cement floor, his head resting over his front paws, eyes fixed on the same road he always watched. But today, there was something different in his gaze. No longer simple waiting. It shimmered with quiet anticipation, rising gently, unmistakably. And then, as the 8th chime echoed from the church tower, a small figure appeared at the far end of the street. Elira, She wore a mint green coat. In her arms was her familiar notebook. Her scarf had been washed, faint traces of antiseptic still clinging to the wool. Her steps were slower still, shaped by the echo of fever, but her eyes sparkled with something clear awake. Rocco stood up. He didn't bark, he didn't run. But his sturdy tail, rigid through so many silent months, wagged. Once, then again. Elira stopped. Her heart beat faster. She hadn't expected anything. She only thought she'd sit like before quietly beside him. But that wag, just a tiny movement, felt like the first hello. She stepped closer. Rocco didn't retreat, nor did he tilt his head in guarded suspicion like before. He simply waited. When Elira sat down on the edge of the wooden step, the dog leaned forward, took a short step, then sat beside her, closer than he had ever dared before. She placed her notebook on her lap and flipped to a new page, but didn't begin to read. Her hands relaxed, one of them gently brushing his back. And this time he tilted his head ever so slightly into her touch. In that warmth, both understood something had shifted. An elderly man with silver hair wrapped in a wool coat and carrying a basket of bread happened to walk by and paused. He watched the scene for a long moment. His gaze followed the slow, steady sway of Rocco's tail, a rhythm like breath newly stitched back together with trust. He murmured as if speaking only to himself, or maybe letting the wind carry his words. Dogs never forget those who came before. But it's even more beautiful when they choose to love someone new. And somewhere inside him, an old memory stirred. Of Bio the dog who had followed him through 3 house moves through a season of war and had laid faithfully by the doorstep all its life, without ever needing to be told to stay. When Bio passed, the man had sworn he'd never adopt again. I couldn't survive another goodbye, he had once said. But today, watching Elira rest her hand on Rocco's neck and seeing Rocco lean into her touch, he understood sometimes it's the creatures we believe to be tethered to the past, who end up guarding the future for someone else. That night Elira wrote, "There is a thing called trust. It's not loud, not hurried. It arrives after all the times someone didn't have to stay, but chose to anyway. Trust is when he looks at me, not to guard, but to wait for a whisper. It's when a single wag of the tail is enough to tell a small heart it's been seen." From that day on, Rocco began to change. Not drastically, not dramatically, but for those who noticed the quiet things, the change was there. He no longer lay pressed against the curb, but sat closer to the wooden steps, where Elira always came. When strangers approached the station, he didn't immediately avert his eyes. He glanced first as if to wonder whether they might stop. He no longer seemed like a shadow waiting for someone lost, but a soul slowly opening to what still remained. And within that forgotten bus stop, a different kind of story was being written. Not in words, but through patience, silent companionship, gentle touches, and the slow rhythm of a tail wagging each afternoon. That day the wind arrived earlier than usual. It didn't howl or rush, but slipped into seams and sleeves, into the tiny cracks between old bricks and sidewalks, still damp from last night's scattered rain. Leaves clung to mud, whispering against one another. The fog was thick enough to gather in your hands, if you tried. Rocco arrived around midday. Instead of lying down as he always did, he sat upright, his body held just tense enough, like a string pulled taut, waiting for the first note to tremble into being. His eyes didn't scan the distance. They remained near, focused on the space next to him where the fog swirled around an empty wooden step. Normally, Elira arrived before the bus stop's shadow tilted fully east. But today, the clock had crept past the hour. And still, she hadn't come. A gust swept through. Rocco took a few steps toward the road, his eyes sweeping the mist-covered street. No one. No footsteps. No familiar mint-green scarf. He turned slowly, reluctantly, and returned to his place. He sat but didn't lie down. Ears perked, eyes open. There was something in the air, some texture in the silence, that made even a dog used to quiet afternoons feel different. At last, near 4 o'clock, Elira appeared. She ran at a slow pace, a crossbody bag at her side, hair messy, cheeks flushed from the wind. Her coat was unbuttoned, shoes streaked with mud. She froze when she saw Rocco sitting there, like always. But this time, when their eyes met, there was a strange, unspoken stillness between them. She walked over without a word, sat down beside him without pulling out her notebook or untying her scarf. Her hands, cold and damp, rested on her knees. She pulled out a small pastry from her bag and placed it beside him, unwrapped, unopened. Rocco didn't eat it. He dipped his nose to sniff the foil softly, then turned to look directly at her. She exhaled quietly, like someone who had both run and held something inside. "I'm late," she whispered, her voice hoarse, unlike how it usually sounded. "Mom cried a lot today. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I did." She looked up, her eyes damp but unbroken. And then I realized, this is the only place where I feel brave enough to think about the things that haven't happened yet. Rocco moved closer. One step, then another. He sat right beside her, leaned his head gently against her shoulder. From a distance, the fog grew denser, softer. The world seemed wrapped in a heavy gray blanket, muting sound, slowing time. The wind still circled around the old wooden awning, bringing with it the scent of wet bark and earth. Two souls, one older, one young, sat side by side, both soaked, both shivering slightly in the chill. But neither moved, neither said much. And in that silence, something quiet was growing, slowly, but undeniably. That afternoon, Windermere felt quieter than usual. Far away car horns faded. The bakery's warm lights flicked on earlier than usual. A man in a long coat passed by, cradling a folder-filled briefcase. He paused, glanced toward the faint silhouettes blurred behind the fog. He didn't approach, didn't call out. But as he turned down a nearby alley, he thought to himself, there are sorrows too heavy for words. But if someone is willing to sit beside them in the cold wind of a late afternoon, that sorrow might lose its sharpest edge. That night, Elira didn't write in her notebook. She simply placed it beside her pillow, open to a clean page, and whispered, "If the wind still blows tomorrow, I'll come again. Not because I'm stronger, but because when I sit next to him, I believe unfinished things can still be written, even with trembling hands and blurred ink." And at that abandoned bus stop, a fog-filled afternoon passed by like that. No promises, no calls. Just two hearts, quieter than time itself, learning how to slow their beating, together. That morning, the sun rose earlier than usual. Its pale light filtered through the mist like golden silk, spreading over the narrow path that led to the bus stop, cloaking it in a soft, honey-colored veil. Elira wore a thick coat, her mint-green scarf tucked neatly around her neck, and in her hand she carried a paper bag holding 2 slices of buttered bread. The wind was gentle. Rocco had arrived early, already curled up on the wooden steps, his tail gently tapping the ground each time he saw her silhouette from afar. Elira smiled, a simple smile, no longer hesitant, no longer wary, like in the early days. Today she planned to tell Rocco a new story, about her first art class at school where, for the first time, she had found the courage to raise her hand and ask for a color. She crossed the street as usual, her steps light. But that morning the dew clung thick on the grass edge, coating the stones with a slick, mossy sheen. Just as she leapt toward the familiar step, her left foot slipped, suddenly tilting her body straight toward the road. The paper bag flew from her hand. Elira didn't even have time to scream. And then, The screech of tires crushed the air. A truck horn split the mist like a blade. A metal mass was barreling down, too fast, too close. In that instant, time shattered into a million shards of glass suspended in the air. Everything slowed. Sounds dulled. And only one motion remained, razor-sharp and searing. Rocco sprang from the wooden step. He didn't think. He didn't look back. All four legs stretched forward, clawing into the damp earth like he was tearing through the distance that remained between Elira and the oncoming wheels. Ears pinned back, eyes wide, his entire body a taut bow flung into danger's path. In the final second, just before metal met skin, Rocco launched his full weight into Elira's side, shoving her out of the truck's path. The impact came, a heavy thud. Tires grinding against gravel and dirt. Brakes screaming in a long burning arc. Then, silence. But not the gentle silence of a breezy afternoon. This was a broken silence, like a breath cut short, like a heartbeat forced to stop before its rhythm could finish. Elira bolted upright from the roadside grass. Her hands were scraped, her knees bloodied, but she was whole. She turned toward where Rocco had been. He lay motionless in the middle of the road, one side of his body dragged in a faint smear across the asphalt. His eyes remained open, gazing toward her without fear, without regret. Only presence. Full and clear, as if to say, "I made it." The truck driver leapt from the cab, his face ashen. He stammered, hands trembling, stumbling back like the truth itself had struck him. Neighbors rushed over. Someone called an ambulance. Someone knelt beside Elira asking if she was okay. But all the voices sounded distant, like echoes from another world. Elira shook them off and ran to Rocco. She dropped to her knees, burying her face in his dirt-matted fur. Her arms wrapped around his head, holding it close to her chest. Blood oozed from his hind leg and chest, but not enough to spread. His breathing was faint. But his eyes, those eyes were still there. "It's me. I'm here," she whispered. "Please don't leave." No one knew how many times she repeated those words. No one dared interrupt, because they understood. This moment belonged to no one else. Only a girl who had relearned trust and a dog who had relearned how to stay, sat in the fractured silence, clinging to each other like the last unbroken pieces of something sacred. That evening, after everything had passed, Elira sat quietly in the emergency clinic. In her hands was the scarf, edges now frayed, streaked with a pale red stain. Her mother sat beside her, gripping her hand, but Elira said nothing. Only when the nurse emerged and gently placed a small pouch on the table. A clump of Rocco's fur brushed and saved by the vet before dressing the wounds. Did the girl begin to tremble? She murmured, "He wasn't afraid. Even when others feared him, he chose me. And when I fell, he was the only one who didn't look away." The next evening, the bus stop was empty. No Rocco, no Elira. Only yesterday's slice of bread, now hardened, sat near the wooden step, and a faint claw mark traced the ground. A mark left by a soul who had once raced like an arrow to protect the most precious thing it had ever chosen. No one remembered exactly how long the horn had blared. Only that when it stopped, the entire town of Windermere seemed to hold its breath. The truck engine had gone silent. The driver knelt on the roadside, head in hands. An elderly woman stood trembling beside the street lamp, her basket of eggs smashed across the sidewalk. Across the road, a child wailed in his mother's arms. But even that sound faded, swallowed by the mist. In the middle of the road, beneath wide eyes and shattered whispers, Rocco lay still, his body sprawled across the skid mark left by the tire. His ash-gray coat clung to dust and blood soaking into the cold ground, as if the road itself was cradling his spirit. One hind leg was twisted unnaturally, His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath dragged up from some deep, primal place. Elira knelt beside him. She didn't sob aloud. She just held tightly to Rocco's leg forehead, pressed against his sticky fur. Wind swept past, carrying the tang of metal and scorched rubber. But she stayed. Her small hands clung to his paw, as if letting go would shatter the last thread tying her to reality. "Please stay." Her voice quivered, but never broke. "You haven't eaten your breakfast?" "I still have things to tell you. I didn't finish the story about art class." "Please, just stay." The words looped over and over, like a quiet, choking lullaby, both a plea and a desperate effort to keep that dog, the only soul who had sat quietly beside her through winter, from slipping away. A middle-aged man, the used bookstore owner, stepped forward ready to pull Elira back. But Mrs. May stopped him just in time. "Don't," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He understands. Let her say what she needs to." A few minutes later, an elderly veterinarian arrived. The townspeople had called him early. He was the same man who had tended to a crushed cat behind Main Street the year before. He knelt beside Elira, his weathered eyes gently scanning the remnants of Rocco's breath. The old man didn't say anything at first. He simply placed a weathered hand over the dog's chest, feeling carefully, then turned to the girl and spoke in a low, steady voice. "His heart's still beating, child, but it's very weak. We need to move him now." Elira nodded. But she didn't lift her head from Rocco's chest. Her hands still gripped his paw tightly, and she whispered one last time, "If it hurts, you can bite me. Just don't leave me behind." A pickup truck had already been prepared by the townspeople. Thick blankets were laid out across the truck bed. They used a wide wooden board to gently lift Rocco's body. 4 people carried it, but Elira was the only one who climbed into the back and sat there, holding Rocco's head in her lap as if trying to cradle a dream that had just slipped from her fingers. The engine turned over. The truck moved slowly, inch by inch. On both sides of the road stood people who once shunned Rocco, who had called him a stray no one dared approach. Now they stood still, their eyes wet with something that felt like shame wrapped in awe. A little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked in a whisper, "Mom, why did that dog save someone?" The mother held him close, didn't answer right away. She simply followed the fading truck with her gaze and murmured, "Because some hearts are born to hold the light for others, even if they have to pass through the dark to do it." At the veterinary clinic at the end of Elm Street, Rocco was rushed into emergency surgery. Elira sat outside in the waiting room, hands clenching her scarf. Her mother had arrived, but didn't say a word. She just rested her hand gently on Elira's shoulder. And for the first time, the girl leaned into her mother's arms. Inside, the heart monitor ticked softly. Slow, painfully, slow but steady. The doctor whispered to his assistant, "This dog, he protected a human with everything he had. Now it's our turn to hold on to him." In that silence, a thin shaft of sunlight broke through the frosted window, falling on the faint stain of blood still spreading across the floor. Elira rose from her chair and walked slowly to the door. She placed her hand on the small glass window pane. She didn't speak. But in her eyes, anyone watching could see it, a flicker of belief, fragile but glowing. And when the wind stirred the hospital hallway, some said they could hear an echo of words long forgotten, drifting in from the once abandoned bus stop. They don't forget people. But when they choose to stay for someone new, their love goes deeper than memory. The recovery room was bathed in a golden hush filtered through thin white curtains. There were no sirens, no screeching wheels, no metal claws clawing at the chest, only stillness. The kind Elira had once grown used to. but that today felt unbearably heavy. She sat on the wooden chair beside the bed, the same place she had been almost all night. Her eyes were ringed with shadows. The hem of her sweater had started to fray. On her lap lay her sketchbook, still open to a blank page. It wasn't that she had nothing to say. It was that the words in her chest were still looking for a form worthy of being written down. And each time she took a deep breath, memories of Rocco came rushing back. So vivid, they felt only minutes old. A full day had passed since the accident. Rocco remained in critical care. The doctors had said his pelvis was cracked, one hind leg was severely damaged, and his lungs showed signs of trauma. But he was still breathing. His eyes still opened, slowly. And most important of all, his heart kept beating. Elira wasn't allowed to visit him. The staff had said he needed complete quiet, absolute peace. So she chose to stay in the next room, the closest place allowed by the world's rules. That afternoon, Elira opened her notebook. She didn't write right away. Instead, she just stared at a line from the previous page. He doesn't bark. He doesn't growl. But he knows how to sit quietly beside those who need to be heard. She turned to a blank page. Her hand held the pen mid-air for a long time. Then at last, she lowered her head and began to write. Slowly, carefully. Today, I'm not going to read anything. I won't tell a happy story either. I don't have the strength to make up something nice just to feel less afraid. But I think you already told your story, and you told it in the bravest way. She paused. Her eyes burned, her hands trembled, but the pen stayed in motion. You didn't need to write anything. You spoke through your eyes, through the way you always stayed beside me, through every moment you chose to wait, when no one made you wait. And yesterday, you told it with your body, by throwing yourself in front of pain so it wouldn't reach me. You never said, "You matter to me," but the way you stayed, the way you didn't leave even when the truck came, was louder than anything you could have said. Elira stopped writing. Her eyes stayed locked on the final lines, rereading them again and again. Like if she believed them hard enough, they might become magic and rewind time back to the moment before everything cracked. Her mother entered the room. In her hands was a cup of warm milk, topped with a soft swirl of cocoa. She placed it gently on the table. No questions, no pressure. Just her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. The doctor said, "If he makes it through tonight, the chances get a lot better," she whispered. Elira nodded faintly, her gaze never leaving the notebook. A little while later, as the sun began to lower toward the western hills, she added one last line. "I wish I could send you this letter, but maybe I don't have to. Because if you heard every word I said during winter, then I'm sure you'll understand today too." She closed the notebook and set it on the table. Her hands wrapped around the cup. Warmth seeped into her fingers, her wrists, and slowly into the aching weight inside her chest. And then, suddenly, as if something called her, she looked up. Her eyes caught a beam of light pouring through the window, dancing with dust motes like floating breath. She rose, walked to the glass, pressed her palm to it. Beyond the door leading to the intensive care unit, Rocco lay still. The heart monitor blinked steadily. One ear twitched gently as the sunlight reached his fur. Somehow, he was still listening. Spring arrived early with the scent of pine wood and new sun in the air. The last traces of snow had melted, revealing patches of fresh grass and red soil beneath. At the old bus stop on the far end of the street, once forgotten by buses that no longer came, there were people again. Not Elira, not Rocco, but the entire town. A middle-aged man came with a handsaw and a box of nails. An old woman, gloved and steady, scrubbed the wooden steps with a wire brush. 3 young boys busied themselves sweeping moss from the stone foundation, while the bakery owner brought 2 baskets of white flowers. Everyone's hands were busy, but no one was loud. They hadn't agreed on a time. No one sent out invitations. Yet they came. For something unspoken, but deeply understood, this place needed a marker. Something to hold on to what had just passed. The old man with silver hair, the same one who had left the first can of dog food beside Rocco, was the one who brought the wooden sign. It was simple. Crafted from old pine sanded down and lightly oiled to protect it from the weather. Hand-carved letters, uneven, but full of care, etched into the wood with moving clarity. Here once sat a dog who waited for someone who never came, and then became the one worth waiting for. There was no ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just a quiet circle of people who had known each other for years, and a silence that deepened as the sign was placed beside the bus stop, right at the spot where Rocco used to sit every evening. The townsfolk stood still looking at it, as if the words had finally said what none of them could ever bring themselves to speak. From a distance, Elira and her mother appeared. The girl had grown thinner, but the light in her eyes was brighter than ever. In her hand was an old, weathered leather collar, the one the vet had gently removed from Rocco's neck before his very first surgery. Rocco hadn't returned to the stop yet. His wounds were still healing his back legs, weak, but his spirit was growing stronger with each day. The vet had said it would take a few more weeks before he could walk normally again. Yet today, Elira hadn't come in the hope of seeing him. She came so that he would know the place was still being cared for. She stepped closer to the sign and gently touched the carved words. The wood was still fresh. The scent of pine oil clung faintly to her palm. Elira closed her eyes, imagining Rocco sitting there, on those wind-cut days when people passed without noticing. And now, at this very spot, people had finally stopped. To remember, to feel grateful, to understand. He used to wait, Elira whispered. But then, I think someone began waiting for him too. Her mother gave her shoulder a quiet squeeze. There was no need to say anything else. An elderly man pulled out a small piece of bread and placed it gently on the edge of the wooden step. A schoolboy unzipped his backpack and took out a small drawing. Rocco and Elira sitting side by side in the fog. He stuck it to the bakery's front window, where everyone would see it as they passed. A mechanic scribbled a few lines with a thick black marker and taped them to a utility pole. If today you think no one notices, you remember, there was once a dog who waited through winter, just to see a girl walk his way. And everything began from there. Elira opened her notebook and added a line. He couldn't read, but he understood better than anyone. A place once abandoned only needs one brave soul to stay, and eventually someone will return. As she closed the notebook, a breeze swept through. It rattled the new wooden sign. It carried the scent of fresh grass down the street, and it lifted a single strand of dog fur into the light, letting it fall softly to the very place where Rocco once sat. No one picked it up. They left it where it landed, like a trace, a quiet message from life itself that here a dog had once stayed behind. Spring arrived in Windermere like a gentle apology from time. The snow had melted. Green patches had begun to blanket the uneven paths. Birds returned, and the wind, once sharp and stinging when Elira sat alone, now blew softly, scented with young wildflowers and late sunshine. The old bus stop remained. The roof had been patched. The steps had been repainted. But what truly preserved the place was the quiet routine between a girl and her dog. Each afternoon, Elira returned. In her hands was a new notebook, the old one now filled. She didn't always write, and she didn't always read aloud. Some days she simply sat, her hand resting on a folded blue cloth tucked inside her jacket, her eyes watching the road where sunlight always paused right before it reached the shadow of the station. The wooden sign was still there. The words had now been re-outlined in bright white paint, bolder than before, as if the town had chosen to make those words part of its history. That afternoon, the wind arrived early. Elira had just sat down when she heard footsteps. Not the hurried pitter-patter of children, nor the heavy stride of grown-ups, but the sound of claws on pavement, one step at a time, steady and true, as if time itself was retracing its steps. She turned, and there, at the end of the slope leading up to the stop, Rocco was coming. That same gait, slow, firm, sure. But his back legs carried a slight limp. His fur had thinned, revealing patches of newly grown skin. His old collar hung loosely now, more a keepsake than a leash. His eyes were still bright like the first day they saw each other through the fog. But this time, they held something else, a sense of return. Elira stood up, hands trembling. She didn't run. She waited. And Rocco, after a few more steps, stopped right at the edge of the step. He raised his head, then climbed slowly one step at a time, as if every crack in the wood was familiar. She sat down, and Rocco rested his head on her lap, lightly, but clearly like a promise made in silence. No one spoke. They didn't have to. A passerby paused, glanced toward the bus stop, nodded gently, then moved on, carrying with them the image of two quiet silhouettes side by side. The sun tilted lower. The wind rustled through the pines behind the station, carrying with it a soft whispering sound, like someone retelling an old story, not through words, but through the sounds of what once truly happened. And if anyone had asked that day what was so special, they would have answered simply, a dog came back from an old story and sat like he'd never left. Elira opened her notebook and wrote the first line of a new season. He came back, not to start over, but to continue, right where the story had paused because of a whistle, but never ended. She paused, looked at Rocco. We're still here, aren't we? Rocco didn't answer, but his tail tapped gently on the wooden floor, one beat then another, as if his heart was knocking softly on the world to say, I'm still here. And that evening, there was no snow, no sirens, no storm. Only the golden light of day's end casting shadows of a girl and her dog. At a bus stop once forgotten, now a place someone still waits each day. Because sometimes the one worth waiting for isn't the one who returns on time, but the one who chooses to return, even after the world had passed them by. In long, quiet winters, certain lives step into ours, not with a bark or grand gesture, but with steady presence. The story of Elira and Rocco isn't just a tale of a girl and her dog. It's a gentle reminder that trust, once given with sincerity, can turn a stop of sorrow into a beginning of healing. The German Shepherd, strong, loyal, silent, not only shines as a rescue dog or protector, but in the way it chooses to love, quietly, steadily, never asking for anything in return. Rocco, through his unwavering courage and gaze, always turned outward, became a symbol of a love that needs no name, but touches the deepest corners of the heart. We live in a noisy world where simple things are easily overlooked. But moments like the way Rocco waited, the way Elira silently read her journal line by line, remind us to love is a kind of bravery, and to stay is sometimes the greatest act of all. So let's love animals, not just because they're loyal, but because they teach us how to live more fully. And if one day you see a dog sitting alone by a bus stop, don't rush past. You might be looking at a soul who's waiting for someone, or helping someone find their way home.